It's strange how certain days etch themselves into your memory, not because you want to remember them, but because they simply refuse to fade. That morning felt heavier than any I'd lived before. The house was silent, yet every corner seemed to echo his laughter, his voice, his presence. As I dressed in black, my hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the emptiness that had settled deep inside me. Losing a husband after so many years isn't just losing a person, it's losing the rhythm of your days, the small routines that once filled your world without you even realizing it. When I arrived at the church, the scent of lilies filled the air, sweet, almost suffocating. People whispered softly, exchanging condolences, and I nodded politely, barely hearing their words. Every face looked blurred, every hug felt distant. I could hear the priest's voice echoing somewhere in the background, talking about peace, eternity, and rest, but my heart was restless. I kept looking at the coffin in front of me, at the man who had once been my entire world, now lying still, cold, unreachable. They say funerals bring families together, but that day I felt like a stranger among my own. My son stood tall, hiding his grief behind silence, and beside him was my daughter-in-law, composed, delicate, and distant. She looked beautiful, almost too composed, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the floor. I wanted to believe we were united in loss, sharing the same pain, but something about her quietness unsettled me. It wasn't grief. It was something else, something I couldn't name. As the service went on, I found myself studying every small detail, every gesture, every sigh. Maybe it was the grief clouding my judgment, or maybe it was that instinct only years of life can give you, the one that whispers when something doesn't fit. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the prayers, on the people who came to pay their respects, on the memories that flooded my mind, but my eyes, they kept drifting back to her. The music began to play, that slow, sorrowful tune that always seems to make time stand still. My heart clenched with each note, and tears welled up despite my effort to hold them back. I thought about our first dance, our arguments, the long nights we spent talking about everything and nothing. I thought about the promises we made, to stand by each other, to protect our family, to love until the end. And now this was the end. It was during that silence between one prayer and another that I noticed something small, almost invisible to anyone else. My daughter-in-law leaned closer to the coffin, her movements subtle, deliberate. I couldn't quite see what she was doing, but something about the way her hands moved caught my attention. It wasn't a gesture of farewell. It wasn't a kiss or a touch of affection. It was secretive, controlled. I remember blinking, wondering if my eyes were deceiving me. But no, she slipped something into his jacket pocket. Something small, quick, almost like she didn't want anyone to notice. And that was the moment everything changed for me. The air around me seemed to shift, heavy with questions I wasn't ready to ask. What could she possibly be hiding? Why would she do something like that there in front of everyone during a funeral? I wanted to believe it was nothing, that grief makes people do strange things, that perhaps it was some sentimental gesture. But deep down, something told me otherwise. Even as I tried to refocus, the image replayed in my mind over and over, her hand slipping something into his jacket. A motion so quick, yet so haunting. I sat frozen, my tears suddenly replaced with confusion, with unease. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur, but my heart wouldn't calm. That single act had planted a seed of doubt, and no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't unsee it. That day was supposed to be about goodbye, about closure, about honoring a life shared and lost. But instead, it became the day that opened a door I didn't know existed, one that led me into truths I was never meant to discover. I remember that moment so vividly, as if time itself decided to slow down just to make sure I wouldn't forget. Everything around me was muted, the whispers, the soft sobs, the rustle of tissues, and yet, in that stillness, my eyes caught something that pulled me out of my grief like a sudden jolt. My daughter-in-law had moved closer to the coffin. There was nothing unusual about that, not at first. People often leaned in to say their goodbyes, to whisper a last word, to touch the hand of the one they loved for the final time. But there was something about the way she moved, quiet, deliberate, cautious, that didn't feel right. I watched her through a blur of tears, thinking maybe she was simply overcome with emotion, but then her hand slipped into the inner pocket of my husband's jacket. The motion was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. I saw the way she hesitated, looking around as though checking if anyone was watching, and then she placed something inside before pulling her hand back quickly, like a child caught doing something forbidden. My heart skipped. For a second, I thought perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me, that maybe she was just adjusting his clothing or tucking in a flower petal, but I knew what I saw, and no amount of denial could make that image fade. 1,000 questions started racing through my head. What could she possibly have slipped in there, and why? There was nothing casual about it, nothing innocent. Her expression was controlled, her movements too careful. I tried to convince myself it was something sweet, maybe a letter, a photo, a small token of love she wanted him to carry into the afterlife. But if that were true, why did it feel so secretive? Why did my chest tighten as if I had just witnessed something forbidden? I tried to look away, but my mind wouldn't let go. My hands began to tremble, not from sorrow anymore, but from confusion. I felt a strange pull inside me, a need to know, an unease that spread like wildfire. I watched her step back and bow her head, her face as serene as if nothing had happened. People around us continued to pray, unaware of the tension building in my chest, and yet I couldn't stop watching her. The way she wiped her tears looked rehearsed, almost performative, as though she knew eyes might be on her, but not, really, watching. I remember whispering to myself, "What are you hiding?" But the question dissolved into the air, unanswered. I looked at my husband's still face, his jacket resting perfectly against his chest, and all I could think about was that hidden thing inside, the thing that didn't belong there. It was like a shadow that suddenly entered the light, silent but undeniable. The rest of the ceremony became a blur. People came to me, offered hugs, shared kind words, but I wasn't really there. I nodded when I needed to, smiled when expected, but my mind was elsewhere, trapped in that one fleeting motion of her hand disappearing into the jacket. Grief and suspicion are a cruel combination. They twist your thoughts until you can't tell what's real and what's imagined. And yet, deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I saw what I saw. After the service, as people began to leave, I caught her eyes for a moment. She smiled softly, that polite, almost empty smile people give when words feel unnecessary. But in that instant, something inside me shifted. There was something behind that smile, a flicker of guilt or maybe fear. It was faint, but it was there. And it made my heart sink even deeper. Standing there, surrounded by flowers and farewells, I realized that grief had just become more complicated. It wasn't just about saying goodbye anymore. It was about the secret I had just witnessed, the mystery that now lay buried inside the man I loved. I didn't know what she had hidden or why, but one thing was certain, whatever it was, I could never unsee it. After that moment, my heart refused to settle. The funeral continued around me like a slow, distant echo, but I wasn't really there anymore. I was caught between grief and suspicion, torn apart by two emotions that didn't belong together. One half of me wanted to stay grounded in sorrow, to mourn the man I had loved for most of my life, to let the tears fall freely without any other thought. But the other half, the restless, uneasy part, kept circling back to what I'd seen. That quiet motion of her hand, that hidden act at his coffin, it gnawed at me like an unanswered question I wasn't ready to face. I tried to tell myself it was grief playing tricks, that when you lose someone, your mind becomes fragile, desperate to find meaning in every movement and silence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I had lived long enough to know the difference between imagination and instinct, and what I felt wasn't confusion, it was warning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face again, her calm expression, her deliberate stillness. It wasn't the face of someone breaking under sorrow. It was the face of someone carrying a secret. That thought haunted me as the hours went by. I remember sitting quietly in the car on the way home, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it over the sound of the engine. My son was driving, silent and lost in his own grief, while my daughter-in-law sat beside him, looking out the window, her expression unreadable. Every time the light from the street lamps hit her face, I caught myself searching for a clue, anything that could explain what I had seen. But she gave nothing away. Her composure was perfect, almost unnatural for a day like that. When we got home, the house felt hollow, stripped of its warmth. Everything he had touched seemed frozen in time. His chair, his books, the faint trace of his cologne lingering in the air. I wanted to collapse into my sorrow, to cry, without restraint, to let myself grieve properly. But my mind wouldn't let me. That image kept replaying, again and again, each time sharper than before. I sat in the dim light of the living room, feeling my heart wrestle with itself. One side begged me to let it go, to honor his memory, to focus on love, not suspicion. The other whispered that something wasn't right, that what I saw had meaning, that it wasn't just an innocent gesture. And that whisper grew louder with every minute. The guilt of it was unbearable. How could I, in the middle of such a sacred goodbye, let doubt creep into my heart? What kind of person questions someone's actions at a funeral? I felt ashamed, angry at myself for even caring. But then the image would return, the exact movement of her hand, the quick glance around, the way she pressed her lips together after she did it. No, this wasn't just grief talking, this was something else. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat by the window, watching the dark sky, asking questions to a silence that didn't answer. What did she put there? Why hide it? Was it something personal between them? Something about him that I didn't know? Each possibility hurt in its own way. Every time I thought I had reached the end of my questions, a new one appeared. And in that sleepless night, I began to realize that my grief had changed shape. It wasn't just about losing him anymore. It was about losing certainty, losing trust in the people around me, and wondering how much of my life had been lived without knowing the full truth. By morning, I promised myself I wouldn't let it consume me. I told myself I'd focus on the memories, on the love, on everything we'd built together. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The mind can try to silence the heart, but once a seed of doubt is planted, it grows quietly in the dark, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. And that was exactly what happened to me. No matter how much I tried to push it away, the question of what she did and why kept finding its way back, haunting every quiet corner of my thoughts. Days passed, but the image of what I'd seen wouldn't leave me. It followed me everywhere, in the soft hum of the house at night, in the creak of the floorboards, even in the way the morning light touched his empty chair. Grief had its rhythm, but mine was broken by that unanswered question. What did she hide? I tried to let it go, I truly did. I told myself it didn't matter, that no secret, no gesture could change the fact that he was gone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Some things don't fade with time. They demand to be uncovered. It started with small, quiet moments of doubt. When I walked past the framed photos of him, my eyes lingered longer than before, wondering how much of what I'd known was real. I'd look at his handwriting on old notes, the gifts he'd given me over the years, the memories we built, and then my thoughts would drift back to her. What if there was something between them I never saw? What if that secret gesture at his coffin wasn't just strange, but meaningful? The thought made my chest tighten, but the more I tried to silence it, the louder it grew. One afternoon, when the house was empty, I did something I wasn't proud of. I went into his things. I told myself it was to sort through his belongings, to decide what to keep and what to give away, but that wasn't the real reason. I was searching for a clue, a connection, something that could explain what I'd seen, drawer after drawer, box after box, all filled with pieces of a life I thought I understood. And then, tucked inside one of his old journals, I found it. A letter. Folded neatly, the handwriting unfamiliar. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. The first few lines made my breath catch. It was from her, my daughter-in-law. The words were soft, almost poetic, but heavy with emotion. She wrote about gratitude, about secrets kept, about promises made long before I ever suspected there were any. Each line blurred as tears welled up, but I kept reading, every word cutting deeper than the last. She wrote that he had helped her during a dark time in her life before she ever became part of our family. He had supported her quietly without telling anyone, not out of guilt or shame, but out of compassion. She said she owed him everything for that kindness, for believing in her when no one else did. The object she placed in his jacket was a token, a letter of thanks, a promise of remembrance, something she wanted him to carry with him as a final goodbye. I remember sitting there, the paper trembling in my hands, a mix of relief and heartbreak washing over me. For days I had imagined betrayal, deception, something cruel or selfish. But what I found was something else entirely, something pure, almost beautiful in its sincerity. It wasn't a secret of betrayal, it was a secret of gratitude. She had hidden it not out of shame, but out of love. A private goodbye meant only for him. Still, the revelation didn't bring instant peace. It brought questions of a different kind. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he kept that part of his life separate from ours? It hurt to think that there were things he carried silently, moments he never shared. But as the tears fell, I began to understand that maybe it wasn't about exclusion. Maybe it was about protection. Maybe he didn't want to burden me with things that weren't mine to carry. That night, I sat by the window, holding the letter, feeling the strange calm that follows a storm. I realized that the truth I had feared so much wasn't meant to destroy me. It was meant to teach me something. Love, in all its forms, is complicated. It stretches beyond our understanding, and sometimes it exists quietly, in gestures unseen and words unspoken. And as I folded that letter back, I understood that what I had witnessed wasn't something terrible. It was something sacred. Something I was never meant to unsee, because it revealed just how deeply one person's kindness could touch another's life. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less about what she did and more about what it all meant. The shock had softened into reflection, and though my heart still ached, my mind began to understand something deeper about life, love, and the hidden corners of people's hearts. Grief has a strange way of stripping everything down to its truth. It forces you to see the world differently, to face the things you ignored, and to learn lessons you never asked for. That moment at the funeral and everything that came after taught me more than any peaceful year of life ever could. At first, I was angry at her for keeping something secret, angry at him for not sharing, and angry at myself for doubting them both. But anger, I realized, is often just pain in disguise, pain that doesn't know where to go. When I read her letter, when I finally understood the meaning behind that small, mysterious gesture, I felt the anger start to fade. In its place came something I hadn't expected: humility. Because sometimes we think we know people completely, especially the ones we love the most, but the truth is, no one belongs to us entirely. Everyone has their own story, their own moments of connection that don't always include us, and that's not betrayal, it's simply being human. I began to see my husband differently. For years, I had believed I knew every layer of him, every thought that crossed his mind. But now I realized he had carried so much quietly: kindnesses he never spoke of, burdens he never complained about, and compassion that reached further than I had imagined. He had given something to her, not in the way my insecurities once feared, but in the way a good man gives to anyone who needs it. It made me proud and sad all at once. Proud that I had loved a man whose heart was that generous, and sad that I had let my doubt overshadow his goodness, even for a moment. In her, I learned something about her too. I saw her not as a stranger who married into our family, but as a person with her own pain, her own gratitude, her own way of honoring the one who had helped her find her strength. I understood that her act wasn't one of deceit, but one of devotion. She didn't do it to hide something from me. She did it because she wanted to leave a piece of her truth with him. In a way, it was her way of saying thank you and goodbye in the most private way she could. That realization changed me. It made me softer, more patient, more willing to see beyond appearances. It taught me that sometimes people carry love and loyalty in ways that don't look familiar to us. And when we judge too quickly, we risk missing the quiet beauty behind their actions. Life is full of moments that don't make sense at first until they do. And when they do, they leave behind lessons that shape who we become. I learned that forgiveness isn't always about pardoning someone else. Sometimes it's about forgiving ourselves for being human, for reacting out of fear, for letting grief distort our understanding of love. I had to forgive myself for not trusting, for letting one fleeting moment make me question the goodness of the people around me. And once I did, I felt lighter, freer, almost as if a part of my grief had been lifted. Love doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it's hidden in silence, in gestures no one else understands, in words left unsaid. My husband's kindness, her gratitude, and even my confusion, they were all part of the same story, the same fragile, beautiful truth of being human. And as I stood by his grave one last time, I realized that every secret, every tear, every unanswered question had led me not to bitterness, but to understanding. Because in the end, the things we don't expect often teach us the most about the meaning of love. Peace didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in quiet mornings when the sun touched the curtains, in the soft hum of the house that once felt empty, in the way I learned to breathe again without the weight of confusion pressing on my chest. For a long time, I thought I'd never be able to move past that day, that moment I could never unsee. But time has its own way of healing, not by erasing what happened, but by helping you see it differently. And slowly, the sharp edges of that memory began to smooth into something I could live with, something I could even learn from. There was a time when I thought that moment would define the rest of my life. I thought I'd always look at her and see only that secret gesture, always wonder what it meant, always feel that sting of uncertainty. But instead, I found that the more I accepted it, the more it began to teach me. It taught me that life is rarely clear, that people are layered, that love and loss can live side by side in the same heart. It taught me that the things we don't understand right away aren't always meant to hurt us. Sometimes they're meant to show us something about ourselves. I started to find comfort in small things again. The smell of his old books, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, the laughter of family echoing faintly down the hall. These things reminded me that even though he was gone, his presence wasn't. It lingered quietly in the people he touched, in the kindness he left behind, in the lessons he taught without ever speaking them aloud. The more I thought about him, the more I realized that his final act wasn't to leave me broken. It was to remind me of the strength he always believed I had. And with that realization came peace. Not the kind of peace that makes you forget, but the kind that lets you remember without pain. The kind that allows you to look back and smile, even when tears still find their way to your eyes. I learned to stop asking why she did what she did, and instead to see it for what it truly was, a moment of human emotion, raw and real, a moment that in its own strange way connected us both to him one last time. Forgiveness found me quietly. It didn't arrive with grand gestures or sudden clarity. It came one day when I looked at her, not as the woman who had done something I couldn't unsee, but as someone who had lost too. Someone who had her own story, her own grief, her own need for closure. And I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something I gave her. It was something I gave myself. Because holding on to suspicion had only kept me chained to the pain. Letting it go set me free. Now, when I think of that day, I don't see it as a wound anymore. I see it as a turning point. The moment that forced me to look deeper into love, not as something perfect or predictable, but as something messy and profoundly human. It reminded me that even in loss, there can be understanding. Even in confusion, there can be compassion. And sometimes what we think of as an ending is really just a beginning disguised in grief. I'll never forget what I saw that day, and maybe I'm not supposed to, because that moment, strange, painful, and unforgettable, became a part of my story too. It taught me that peace doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from learning to live gracefully with the ones you'll never get.